Gene Hackman was standing at the door in a white uniform with green piping when he saw the dress blues walking toward him. He recognized the walk before he recognized the face. It was the kind of walk that only a career Marine has. Rigid, purposeful, like every step was a statement. Gene's hand was already reaching for the door handle when the man stopped directly in front of him. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. Then the Marine leaned in close enough that Gene could smell the cigarette smoke on his breath, and he said 7 words that would echo in Gene Hackman's head for the next 13 years. "Hackman, you are a sorry son of a bitch." The Marine didn't wait for a response. He walked through the door that Gene held open for him and disappeared into the Howard Johnson's restaurant without looking back. Gene stood there, frozen, his white-gloved hand still gripping the brass handle. The Shriners Convention crowd pushed past him. Tourists laughed and chattered. The sounds of Times Square filled the air. But Gene Hackman heard none of it. He was back in Qingdao, China. He was 19 years old again, and that man, that recruiting sergeant who had signed his papers back in 1947, had just seen exactly what Gene Hackman had become. Nothing. To understand what that moment meant, you need to understand who Gene Hackman was before he became Gene Hackman. Because the man standing at that door in 1958 wasn't a movie star. He wasn't even an actor. He was a 38-year-old failure in a ridiculous uniform, and everyone who had ever believed in him had been proven wrong. Eugene Allen Hackman was born on January 30th, 1930, in San Bernardino, California. His father, Eugene Ezra Hackman, worked the printing press at the local newspaper. His mother, Anna, was a waitress who had dreams of being an actress herself. They moved constantly, chasing work, chasing stability, chasing something that always seemed just out of reach. When Gene was 13 years old, his father walked out the front door and never came back. Gene would later describe that moment in an interview. The way he looked at me, I knew he wasn't coming back. He paused. It's only been 65 years or so. He tried to laugh, but the laugh didn't reach his eyes. Some wounds don't heal. They just scar over. After his father left, Gene's mother moved the family to Danville, Illinois, to live with her mother, Beatrice. It was a small town, a quiet town, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody else's business. Gene hated it. He was shy, awkward, the new kid who didn't fit in. He found his only escape at the local movie theater, watching James Cagney and Errol Flynn transform into heroes on the screen. I loved the idea that somebody could convince me that they were a sea captain without being phony, Gene would later say. I'd grown up shy. Acting seemed like a way of maybe getting around that, getting to be somebody. At 16, Gene dropped out of high school. He walked into a Marine Corps recruiting office and lied about his age. The recruiting sergeant, a man whose name Gene would never forget, looked at the skinny kid standing in front of him and asked one question. "You sure about this, son?" Gene nodded. "Yes, sir." The sergeant signed the papers. 4 months later, Gene Hackman was on a transport ship crossing the Pacific Ocean, heading toward China in the middle of a civil war. He served 4.5 years as a field radio operator. He was stationed in Qingdao and later Shanghai as part of Operation Beleaguer, the Marine Corps' occupation of China's Hebei and Shandong provinces. He worked for Armed Forces Radio, playing disc jockey for his fellow Marines. He broke both legs in a motorcycle racing accident. He was demoted multiple times for insubordination. I had trouble with authority, Gene admitted years later. I still do. When he was discharged in 1951, Gene had no idea what to do with his life. He drifted. He tried journalism at the University of Illinois under the GI Bill. He dropped out. He moved to New York. He worked as a soda jerk, a furniture mover, a shoe salesman. He polished leather furniture at the Chrysler Building on the night shift, a job he would later call the worst I ever had. And then, at 26 years old, Gene Hackman decided to become an actor. He enrolled at the Pasadena Playhouse in California on the GI Bill. It was one of the most prestigious acting schools in the country. Gene arrived with nothing but determination and a vague sense that maybe, just maybe, this was what he was meant to do. He met another aspiring actor there, a 19-year-old kid from Los Angeles named Dustin Hoffman. They became friends instantly. They would climb to the roof of the building and play drums together, Gene on the congas and Dustin on the bongos, pretending to be Marlon Brando. But the instructors at the Pasadena Playhouse didn't see what Gene and Dustin saw in each other. They saw two misfits who didn't belong. At the end of the semester, the school held a vote. Gene Hackman and Dustin Hoffman were named least likely to succeed. Gene's grades were even worse. On a scale of 1 to 10, he received a 1.4, the lowest score the Pasadena Playhouse had ever given anyone. After 3 months, he was expelled. The official reason, not having talent. Gene packed his bags and moved to New York City with Dustin. They shared a tiny one-bedroom apartment on 2nd Avenue and 26th Street. Dustin slept on the kitchen floor for 3 weeks until Gene physically dragged him out to find his own place. Eventually, Dustin moved in with another friend, a young actor named Robert Duvall, and the three of them spent years scraping by, auditioning for anything they could get, working odd jobs to pay rent. That's when Gene got the job at Howard Johnson's. It was during a Shriners convention in Times Square. The restaurant wanted extra doormen, and they provided the uniforms, white with green piping, matching hats, the whole ridiculous outfit. Gene needed the money. He took the job. He had been standing at that door for a week when the recruiting sergeant walked up. "Hackman, you are a sorry son of a bitch." Gene stood there after the Marine disappeared inside. His face was burning. His hands were shaking. A family of tourists pushed past him, and he opened the door automatically, not even seeing them. He thought about everything that had led to this moment. His father walking out, the Pasadena Playhouse kicking him out, the instructors who said he had no talent, and now this. A man who had known him at 16 years old, who had seen him sign up to serve his country, was looking at him in a doorman's uniform and seeing exactly what everyone else saw: a failure. That night, Gene went back to his apartment. Dustin wasn't there. The place was empty. Gene sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall. He thought about quitting. He thought about going back to Illinois, getting a real job, living a normal life. He thought about all the people who had told him he would never make it. And then something shifted. Years later, Gene would describe what happened in that moment to Vanity Fair magazine. "It was more psychological warfare, because I wasn't going to let those fuckers get me down. I insisted with myself that I would continue to do whatever it took to get a job. It was like me against them. And in some way, unfortunately, I still feel that way." Gene Hackman didn't quit. He went back to the door the next morning. He put on the ridiculous white uniform. He opened doors for tourists and Shriners and anyone else who walked by. And every time someone looked through him like he wasn't there, he reminded himself of what that Marine had said. "Hackman, you are a sorry son of a bitch." He used it as fuel, but the humiliations weren't over. A few weeks later, Gene was working at the same Howard Johnson's when he saw a familiar face walking toward him. It was an instructor from the Pasadena Playhouse, the same school that had expelled him, the same school that had voted him least likely to succeed. The instructor stopped in front of Gene. He looked at the uniform. He looked at the hat. He looked at Gene's face. And then he smiled. "Well, well, Hackman." The instructor's voice was dripping with satisfaction. "I always knew you wouldn't amount to anything. And here's the proof." Gene didn't respond. He just opened the door and let the man walk through. That night, Gene made a decision. He would prove them wrong. All of them. The Marine, the instructor, his father who had walked out, every single person who had ever looked at him and seen nothing. He auditioned for everything. Off-Broadway plays, television commercials, bit parts in forgotten shows. He got rejected more times than he could count, but he kept going. He got small roles on Route 66. He did summer stock. He performed in off-Broadway productions that nobody saw. He was 33 years old when he finally made his Broadway debut in Children from Their Games in 1963. It wasn't a hit, but it was a start. The next year, he landed a role in Any Wednesday at the Music Box Theater. It ran for over 100 performances. People started to notice him. Warren Beatty saw him and remembered. In 1967, Beatty cast Gene as Buck Barrow in Bonnie and Clyde. Gene was 37 years old. He had been acting professionally for over a decade. He had been told he had no talent. He had been voted least likely to succeed. He had been called a sorry son of a bitch by a man in dress blues. And now he was being nominated for an Academy Award. Gene didn't win that night. But 4 years later, on April 15, 1971, he stood on the stage at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles, holding an Oscar in his hands. He had won Best Actor for his role as Detective Jimmy Popeye Doyle in The French Connection. 13 years. 13 years from that door at Howard Johnson's to this stage. Gene looked out at the audience. The most powerful people in Hollywood were applauding him. The same industry that had ignored him for years was now celebrating him. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he heard that voice again. "Hackman, you are a sorry son of a bitch." Gene smiled. In his acceptance speech, he thanked the director, William Friedkin. He thanked the producers. He thanked his fellow nominees. But he didn't mention the Marine. He didn't mention the Pasadena Playhouse. He didn't mention any of the people who had told him he would never make it. He didn't have to. The Oscar in his hand said everything that needed to be said. Years later, in a 2000 interview with Naval History magazine, Gene was asked directly about the incident with the recruiting sergeant. The interviewer said, "We've heard a story that your former company commander once dressed you down as a sorry son of a bitch when he saw you working as a hotel doorman after your discharge from the Marine Corps. Is that true?" Gene paused. Then he corrected the record. "Well, it was something like that. He was actually my recruiting sergeant. Why he remembered me, I don't know." The interviewer asked what it meant to him. Gene's answer was revealing. "It just meant that I looked terrible, that I was never a great Marine. I suppose people who end up making the Marine Corps a career would see somebody like myself as a traitor to the Corps, because I diminished the look of a Marine by wearing this tatty-looking uniform." He paused again. It did give me pause for a while. That was Gene Hackman's way of saying it nearly broke him, but he didn't let it. Gene Hackman went on to win a second Academy Award for Unforgiven in 1992. He was nominated 5 times total. He appeared in over 80 films. He became one of the most respected actors of his generation, and throughout his entire career, he carried that moment with him. The white uniform, the green piping, the brass door handle, the smell of cigarette smoke, and those 7 words that changed everything. Dustin Hoffman, his old roommate from those struggling days, was asked about Gene after his death in February 2025. Hoffman's tribute revealed something remarkable. He was expelled from our school after 3 months for not having talent. It was the first time they ever did that. He was that good. Hoffman explained, "He was so natural, they didn't think it was acting. They couldn't see what he was doing. He was that good." The same quality that got him expelled from acting school made him one of the greatest actors who ever lived. The instructors couldn't recognize genius because it didn't look like what they expected. Neither could the Marine. In 2004, Gene Hackman retired from acting. He moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, with his wife, Betsy. He wrote novels. He avoided Hollywood. He lived quietly, far from the people who had once looked through him like he wasn't there. When asked in 2011 if he would ever return to acting, Gene said, "If I could do it in my own house, maybe, without them disturbing anything, just 1 or 2 people." He laughed. "But I really don't want to do it any longer." He had nothing left to prove. On February 18, 2025, Gene Hackman died at his home in Santa Fe. He was 95 years old. The tributes poured in from across Hollywood. Clint Eastwood, Francis Ford Coppola, Dustin Hoffman. All of them remembered a man who had transformed American cinema. But the real story of Gene Hackman isn't about the Oscars or the famous roles or the legendary performances. It's about a moment that nobody witnessed except the 2 men involved. A moment at a door in Times Square. A man in dress blues. A man in a white uniform with green piping. 7 words. "Hackman, you are a sorry son of a bitch." Gene Hackman spent 67 years proving that man wrong, and he never stopped. Not when he was opening doors for tourists. Not when he was winning Academy Awards. Not when he was walking away from Hollywood on his own terms. Because that's who Gene Hackman was. Not the cool guy in the movies. Not the legendary actor. Just a kid from Danville, Illinois, whose father walked out when he was 13. A Marine who never quite fit in. A drama school reject who was told he had no talent. A doorman in a ridiculous uniform who refused to let the bastards get him down. That's the Gene Hackman story that should be told. Not the awards, not the fame. The man who stood at that door in 1958 and decided that the only response to humiliation was excellence. And he was excellent for 67 years, until the day he died.